A few days ago, my kids came bursting through the door with a tiny bunny they'd found and begged us to keep it. Our house is already full with several pets, and we simply can't take on a wild rabbit. The bunny seemed big enough to fend for itself, so I tried to gently explain to my kids that it needed to go back to its own family. They were visibly upset by the idea, but after some persuasion, they reluctantly agreed to help return the bunny to its rightful home. However, I was swamped with work and couldn't go with them, so my wife took on the task instead. Before she left, I advised her to release the bunny in the thorn bushes at the far end of our property. I thought this would be the safest place because, living in a rural area, we have a lot of predators around. Thorn bushes would provide some cover and give the bunny a fighting chance. After I got back to work, I was interrupted a short while later by my kids running back into the house, sobbing loudly. My wife was following behind them, trying to calm them down and downplay the situation. I immediately sensed something was wrong and asked what had happened. My eldest, through tears, told me that their mother had let the bunny go right in the middle of our yard, and a hawk had swooped down and grabbed it. They described how the bunny had screamed in distress, and their vivid recounting made my stomach churn. I was shocked and deeply upset. The thought of the poor bunny being taken so brutally, especially after I'd specifically told my wife to let it go in a safer spot, made me furious. My wife's response was dismissive. She said it was just a bunny and that the kids would get over it. But that response was completely unacceptable to me. I had warned her about the predators, and now our kids had to witness such a traumatic event. Both of them retreated to their rooms, refusing to talk to their mother, and when she tried to reach out, they angrily called her the bunny killer. I've tried to mediate the situation, but the kids remain hurt and distant, and my frustration with my wife hasn't subsided. She's now upset with me for not supporting her, saying that as husband and wife, we should always stand by each other. We ended up in a heated argument where I brought up all the times she hadn't supported me. This only made her cry, and she retreated to our room, sulking and refusing to discuss things further. Now I'm left questioning if I mishandled the situation. I get that hawks need to eat, and they're everywhere in our area, but I didn't want our young kids, who are only 4 and 5, to see something so upsetting. I grew up in the countryside, and my wife comes from the city, so we come from very different backgrounds. Back when I was a kid, if we came across a wild animal in trouble, we always tried to release it in a place where it had the best chance of survival. I want to be clear that I didn't yell at my wife. I did admonish her for not following my advice, but I kept my tone calm. Even during our argument, we spoke in whispers so the kids wouldn't hear us. I couldn't go with them to release the bunny because I was tied up with work. I work from home half the week and need to be available by phone at all times unless it's during my lunch break. I've never used the nickname our kids have started calling her, and I've been actively trying to get them to stop using it. I believe calling her that is demeaning and would make me no better than a bully if I used it myself. When my wife discovered that I had shared our situation with friends and acquaintances, her reaction was explosive. The intensity of her anger led to a major confrontation between us, resulting in a week of the silent treatment. During that period, I made several attempts to address the issue with our children, who were still treating their mother poorly in the wake of the bunny incident. I enforced small groundings and timeouts, hoping to curb their behavior. Despite these efforts, the nickname Bunny Killer continued to resurface whenever the kids were upset with her. It was as if the incident had permanently tainted their perception of her. After a couple of weeks of this strained atmosphere, my wife finally softened her stance and admitted that she should have listened to me regarding the bunny. She acknowledged that releasing it in the thorn bushes, as I suggested, would have been a safer choice. Her explanation was that she felt a strong need to defend her actions because she didn't want to admit she was wrong. I accepted her apology, though I was still deeply unsettled by the whole situation. I also apologized for making the Reddit post, hoping to mend our relationship. I suggested that we attend marriage counseling to work through our issues, but she flatly refused. She insisted that there was nothing wrong with our marriage and dismissed the idea as unnecessary. Seeing that things seemed to be improving, albeit slowly, I chose not to press the issue further, hoping that our relationship would heal on its own. Unfortunately, the semblance of peace was short-lived. A few weeks later, my eldest daughter approached me with a look of distress and hesitation. She wanted to tell me something but was clearly frightened. I comforted her and assured her that she could share anything with me without fear of judgment or repercussions. What she revealed was nothing short of a bombshell, radically altering the entire situation. She told me that for months, while I was at work on Saturdays, my wife had been bringing a man over to our house, whom she referred to as her special friend. This man was a former colleague of hers, and she had used various forms of bribery to ensure the kids kept quiet about the visits. My eldest had sensed something was very wrong and had mustered the courage to confide in me. It's incredibly frustrating how people often dismiss the observations and feelings of children. I had been noticing my wife's behavior shift in recent months. She had become increasingly irritable and short-tempered, particularly with our children. When I first showed her my Reddit post about the bunny incident, her response was a torrent of criticisms. She attacked every aspect of me, my appearance, my character, my habits, and even my family. She even dragged up my past smoking habit, which I had quit over 10 years ago. Her behavior escalated to the point where she locked me out of our bedroom and cried so loudly that her sobs reverberated throughout the house. It was clear that something was seriously amiss. When my eldest daughter shared her revelations with me, everything started to fall into place. Her erratic behavior and mood swings were reminiscent of the extreme moodiness she displayed during her pregnancies, but this time it was even more intense. Based on my research, conversations with friends, and insights from a counselor, it became apparent that her behavior was a mix of hormonal changes and the stress of infidelity. While I'm no expert in psychology, the connection seemed plausible and consistent with what I had observed. I desperately wanted to believe that there was some misunderstanding, but my doubts were overwhelming. I decided to install hidden cameras to uncover the truth. I had the cameras delivered to my workplace to avoid any suspicion at home. On the night my wife went out for a girls' night with her friends, I set up the cameras. The installation process was straightforward. I connected them to the Wi-Fi network and was able to monitor every room of the house from my home PC, laptop, and work computer. At first, I worried that I might be overstepping boundaries, but if I was wrong, I could simply remove the cameras, and no one would be any the wiser. Unfortunately, my worst fears were confirmed. Within the first week, I accumulated a substantial amount of evidence showing that the man my wife had been seeing was indeed her former colleague. I vividly remembered him from the various functions where they had seemed unusually close. My wife had left her job years ago to become a full-time mom after the birth of our first child, a mutual decision we had made together. Although she stayed in touch with her former colleagues, who had once been her close friends, it was now evident that these relationships had soured. The revelation of her infidelity and the details of what I uncovered have not only devastated me, but also left her alienated from everyone she once held dear. The situation has reached a point where it feels like our family and social circles have been irreparably damaged. Firstly, the affair partner AP is considerably younger than my wife, by about a decade. He was someone she had taken under her wing at her previous job, grooming him to step into her role when she decided to leave. They had maintained a close relationship ever since, far closer than what would be considered appropriate or professional. While my wife and I are both in our 40s, you wouldn't know it by looking at her. She's exceptionally attractive and often gets mistaken for someone in her 20s. It seems she used her youthful appearance to her advantage, though I'm not sure how much I can blame her for that. After I finally decided to confide in my sister about what was happening, I showed her the footage from the nanny cams. She told me she had been harboring suspicions for some time. She recounted an incident where she had seen my wife at a local bar, getting a little too cozy with a man who was not me. While my sister didn't witness any kissing or overtly inappropriate behavior, there was a considerable amount of physical contact, including frequent touches on the shoulders and lower back. Because she wasn't completely sure of what was happening at the time, she hadn't told me earlier. Determined to uncover the truth, I ordered a GPS tracker and carefully hid it in the trunk of my wife's car. My sister and her husband agreed to help me by tracking my wife's movements. On what was supposedly another night out with friends, they followed the GPS tracker and discovered that she went to a location about 20 miles further away than her usual hangouts. There, they saw her meeting up with the AP. My sister and brother-in-law observed them from their car and recorded their interactions. They noticed that the AP was consistently rubbing my wife's belly while they spoke. This detail was particularly alarming, as it suggested that my wife was pregnant with the AP's child. When I saw the footage, my heart sank. The evidence confirmed what I had suspected, and I felt overwhelmed with emotion. My initial reaction was to seek solace in alcohol, but my sister intervened. She wisely pointed out that drinking would only cloud my judgment and worsen my situation. I decided to take a leave of absence from work, telling my wife it was for a business trip. Her reaction was almost unnervingly enthusiastic. She didn't even attempt to hide her delight at my departure, which was both surprising and disheartening. It made me question everything I thought I knew about her. Was this really the woman I had been married to for nearly 20 years? It felt as if someone who looked exactly like her had taken her place. I even started wondering if she was some sort of imposter, or if I had been living with an alien from a science fiction novel. The more I tried to make sense of it all, the more confused and disillusioned I became. Eventually, I realized that trying to rationalize her actions wasn't going to help me come to terms with what was happening. With the house to herself, my wife had the perfect opportunity to indulge her desires. I had installed cameras throughout the house, hoping to catch any further evidence. My sister and brother-in-law had agreed to take the kids for a few days, which they were excited about because they enjoy their visits to the city. This arrangement provided my wife with the exact opening she needed. Within hours of my departure, she called the AP, who arrived that evening to spend the night. I won't go into explicit detail about what transpired in the house. I'll leave those specifics to the imagination. However, what was particularly distressing was how they openly joked about me and discussed their plans for the future. They talked about their baby and how they needed to come up with a strategy to deal with the pregnancy before it became too noticeable. At that point, my wife was already over 3 months pregnant, and it would have been evident to anyone that the baby wasn't mine. The AP is of a different race from me, which would make it quite obvious at birth that the child was not biologically mine. My wife dismissed his concerns about the baby's appearance, assuring him that they had plenty of time to figure out a plan. Adding to the heartbreak, my wife made a shocking confession. She admitted to the AP that this wasn't her first affair. She had previously been involved with another man when she was 29. She told the AP that she was tired of pretending to be the ideal housewife and felt bored with me, which made her feel old. If it weren't for my financial stability, she said, she would have left me long ago. When the AP questioned her about her plans for our children, her response was chilling. He can have them. She didn't even want to be around our kids anymore, believing they preferred me. Her main focus was on the new baby she would be having with the AP, whom she referred to as her do-over baby. This callous disregard for her family and her apparent eagerness to leave everything behind for a new start with the AP was utterly devastating. The shock of what I had discovered almost drove me to hurl my laptop against the wall of my motel room. The betrayal and disgust I felt were overwhelming. I struggled to contain my emotions, deciding instead to try and numb the pain with a 6-pack of beer. I figured a few drinks might help take the edge off. Afterward, I went to a local diner for a straightforward dinner, hoping that a change of scenery might help clear my head. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the heavy weight of betrayal, so I returned to my room, where I tried to distract myself further by watching a movie. However, as the hours ticked by, sleep eluded me. I spent the entire night in a restless state, my thoughts racing, unable to find peace until sheer exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. I had always prided myself on knowing my wife deeply and loving her unconditionally. I had devoted myself to her completely, believing we were a team. This newfound reality was a painful slap in the face, revealing a side of her I had never seen before. It became clear to me that some people, despite how well you think you know them, can harbor deep-seated deceit that only surfaces when they feel unrestrained. That night, I made a firm decision to pursue a divorce with every legal weapon available, ensuring she would face severe consequences for her actions. I'm normally a patient, kind-hearted person, but there's only so much one can endure before reaching a breaking point. Driven by a mixture of hurt and anger, I sought out the most ruthless divorce attorney I could find the very next day. Living in an at-fault state meant that my wife was already in a vulnerable position, especially with the affair caught on camera. Initially, the attorney seemed hesitant about taking on my case so quickly, but that hesitation vanished as I laid out the full story and showed him some of the damning footage. His initial reluctance transformed into a hungry enthusiasm. A devilish grin spread across his face as we shook hands. He was eager to take on a case like mine, thrilled at the prospect of digging into every aspect of my wife's life and ensuring she faced the full legal ramifications of her betrayal. A few weeks later, I orchestrated the serving of the divorce papers while I was working from home and the kids were at school, my eldest in kindergarten and my youngest in preschool. I arranged for the local sheriff to deliver the papers directly to my wife. The cameras I had installed around the house captured every detail of the moment. When she received the envelope and read its contents, her face transformed from confusion to sheer terror. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She bolted into my office, screaming and hurling accusations at me. Throughout her furious outburst, I remained calm and composed. By then, I had emotionally and mentally disengaged from the marriage and was fully resolved to move forward with the divorce. Even as she attempted to argue and manipulate, I stood firm in my decision. I clearly stated that my decision was final and that I wanted her out of the house. I had been the sole contributor to the mortgage payments, giving me the right to make such a demand. In a desperate attempt to manipulate me further, she screamed that I couldn't do this to her. She even threatened to accuse me of abuse and to get me fired from my job if I took her to court. I told her to go ahead and make any false accusations she wanted. It wouldn't change the fact that she had already decided to betray me by being pregnant with her affair partner's child. Her reaction was a mix of shock and desperation. She asked me how much I knew, and I simply replied that I knew enough. I reiterated that I wanted her to leave the house. She refused, arguing that it was just as much her home as it was mine, and locked herself in the bedroom. The cameras in the bedroom recorded her breakdown. In a dramatic turn, she pulled out her phone and called the police. Her actions were a bizarre mix of feigned panic and a smug satisfaction. If I hadn't already seen through her lies, her performance would have been convincing. When the police arrived, I had the front door wide open and invited them inside. At first, they were aggressive and ready for a confrontation, expecting to find a volatile situation. But as they surveyed the scene, it was clear there had been no physical altercation. Everything was in order and calm. My wife dashed out of the bedroom, clinging to one of the officers' vests, sobbing and claiming I was a dangerous maniac. I asked one of the other officers if I could show them the evidence I had gathered. He agreed, which startled my wife, as she had no idea that I had recorded her actions. Her face went from a mask of feigned distress to one of genuine fear and frustration as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was trapped in the web of her own deceit, and the weight of her lies was finally catching up with her. I was so overwhelmed by a mix of fury and disgust after watching the footage that I nearly hurled my laptop against the wall of my motel room. My emotions were a storm of betrayal and anger, but I managed to control myself and took a more subdued approach to dealing with my feelings. I grabbed a six-pack of beer and headed to a nearby diner, seeking some solace in a simple meal. I ordered dinner, trying to quiet my racing thoughts while I ate, then retreated to a nearby movie theater for a distraction, hoping the film would offer some escape from the raw pain I was feeling. After the movie, I returned to my motel room, where I spent the better part of the night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the revelations I just uncovered. Sleep was elusive, as I grappled with the realization that the woman I had loved so deeply and for so long was not who I thought she was. I had been ready to give her everything, to share my life in ways that only a spouse could. Yet, the person who had been so close to me had revealed herself as someone fundamentally different, someone driven by deceit and cruelty. I was forced to confront the grim truth that some people are capable of unimaginable betrayal, and it's often only when they reveal their true nature that you understand just how wrong you were about them. In that dark moment of clarity, I resolved to act decisively. I was determined to get the most aggressive divorce settlement I could, driven by a deep sense of betrayal and anger. Normally, I'm known for being calm and kind, but when pushed to the edge, my capacity for vengeance can be fierce. The next day, I went straight to a law firm specializing in divorce cases, seeking the most ruthless lawyer they could offer. I explained my situation in detail, showing them the video footage that laid bare my wife's infidelity. Initially, the lawyer seemed hesitant about taking on such a case, perhaps because of the speed with which I wanted to proceed. But when I played the footage for him, his hesitation turned into a gleeful determination. A devilish grin spread across his face as he shook my hand and agreed to take on the case. He was eager to dive into this high-stakes divorce, clearly relishing the opportunity to take down a case with such substantial evidence. A few weeks later, I arranged for my wife to be served with the divorce papers while I was working from home and the kids were at school, my eldest in kindergarten and the youngest in preschool. I had the local sheriff deliver the papers directly to her. The entire encounter was captured on my security cameras. Watching the footage, I saw her face transition from confusion to dread as she read the papers, and then to full-blown fury. She stormed into my office, her face flushed with anger, and began to scream at me. Despite her rage, I maintained a calm demeanor, having already mentally checked out of the marriage. My wife's attempts to argue and manipulate were futile. I had made up my mind and was resolute in my decision. I told her I wanted her out of the house, which I had been the sole contributor to the mortgage for. Her response was to scream, threatening me with fabricated accusations of abuse and claiming she would tell people I was violent, hoping to get me fired from my job. I responded calmly, telling her she could make up any lie she wanted. It wouldn't change the fact that her affair and pregnancy were undeniable. Her shock at my knowledge of her situation was palpable. I reiterated that I wanted her to leave, but she stubbornly insisted that the house was just as much hers as it was mine and locked herself in the bedroom. From the cameras in the bedroom, I watched her have a complete breakdown. In a state of panic, she pulled out her phone and called the police, all the while trying to maintain a facade of distress. Her behavior was a stark contrast to the almost gleeful smile she wore while making the call. She was putting on an elaborate act, but her lies were evident to me. When the police arrived, I had the front door wide open and invited them in. They came in with a readiness for confrontation, but the orderly state of the house and lack of any visible altercations quickly diffused their aggression. As soon as my wife emerged from the bedroom, she latched onto one of the officers, her tears and accusations flying as she claimed I was a maniac. I requested one of the officers to review the evidence I had, and he agreed. The sight of her face as she watched the footage was one of utter disbelief and shock. It was clear that the truth had hit her hard. The police, now fully informed, understood the gravity of her false accusations and manipulations. As they escorted her away, her cries of injustice grew faint, leaving me with the stark realization that the person I had once loved was now a figure of betrayal and deceit. It was a moment of painful clarity, knowing that the woman I had spent nearly 2 decades with was now someone I barely recognized. My wife eventually returned to the house, this time with her affair partner in tow, to collect her belongings. Her AP stayed outside, refusing to step foot inside, while my wife busily packed up what was left of her things. The tension was palpable, and she made a point of ignoring me completely, her silence as cutting as a knife. It was clear she knew the cameras were still rolling and probably feared further incriminating herself. My sister and brother-in-law were there to help oversee the situation, making sure everything went smoothly. BL kept a close watch on the AP from the window, ensuring he stayed out of any potential trouble. When the kids came home from school, their faces lit up with the innocent joy of seeing their mother, only to be met with the cold reality of her departure. Our youngest reached out, tears streaming down her face, but my wife made no move to comfort her or even acknowledge her presence. It was a heart-wrenching sight, but my wife remained resolute in her detachment. As she packed up the last of her things, she took a few of our wedding photos from the wall, smashing them on the floor with a certain deliberate malice. It was as if she was trying to provoke a reaction from me, but I stayed silent. Her attempt to elicit a response failed, and after taking the final bag, she walked out of the house, leaving behind a scene of devastation. Once she was gone, the house felt emptier than ever, and I realized I needed immediate help. I called my elderly mother to come stay with me. I couldn't handle caring for the kids on my own while juggling work and the lack of daycare options. It was a tough adjustment, but I needed her support. To ensure everything was in order, I also ordered DNA tests for both of my children. I was confident they were mine, but with the chaos surrounding the affair, I wanted to be absolutely certain. The tests confirmed what I had hoped. Both kids were indeed mine. I also got tested for STIs to make sure I was in the clear, and thankfully, the results came back clean. A week later, my wife showed up at my door seeking a fresh negotiation. She proposed a clean divorce, where we'd split everything evenly. Her offer was essentially a bid for half of everything I'd worked for, but I firmly turned her down. There was a heated exchange as she argued, her desperation evident. She had come to realize that the laws in this state were not in her favor. We had built our lives here, engaged, married, and lived our entire lives in this state, so the legal system was stacked against her. There was no way she could avoid a significant loss unless I agreed to a more lenient settlement. But I was unyielding. I told her that her actions had betrayed not only me and the kids, but also her own parents, and practically everyone who cared about her. My words were sharp and decisive, and I slammed the door behind her as she left. I didn't see her again until the court proceedings. A few months later, we finally faced each other in divorce court. By then, my wife's pregnancy was quite obvious. She had managed to hire a lawyer, though her affair partner was nowhere to be seen, which was just one more sign of the chaos she had created. I had been bracing for her attempts to deceive the court, and she didn't disappoint. She lied several times, but my extensive collection of video evidence was ready to counter her fabrications. The footage I had captured, which included her incriminating statements and actions, was so thorough that her attempts at deceit were practically futile. Instead of engaging in honest discussions, my wife chose to stall the process. She refused to cooperate and made an array of demands that seemed to increase by the day. She sought a significant chunk of my savings, a laundry list of personal possessions, and demanded that I buy out her share of the house. This was despite her never contributing a single cent to the mortgage or the upkeep of our home. On my end, I was determined to secure full custody of our children and to have her name removed from the house deed. I had video evidence that clearly showed her lack of interest in our children and her readiness to lie about me. Despite her attempts to drag things out and constantly shift her demands, the judge was not inclined to entertain her games. In an at-fault state like ours, her claim of adultery severely undermined her case. Her attempt to frame me only made matters worse. By the end of the proceedings, she had lost all custody of our children and walked away with nothing more than her personal belongings, a fair financial settlement under the circumstances, and the car I had bought for her. The car's title was in my name, but I signed it over without hesitation, considering how little she had been involved in the kids' lives during the divorce process. In the weeks following the court ruling, my ex-wife continued to spread lies about me, but my sister made sure the truth came out. She let our mutual friends know about the affair, and once the truth was known, people began to distance themselves from her. The fallout was swift and thorough. My ex and her affair partner eventually left town together. I heard that while the affair partner wasn't fired, he was transferred to a different location, but the specifics of where didn't concern me. The important thing was that they had both left. I hope they ended up in a place that was as far from here as possible. Whether they were sent to the coldest, most remote corner of the globe or not, it made no difference to me. What mattered was that they were gone. As for my ex, she should have had her do-over baby by now. I can only hope that the new life she chose was worth the immense cost of the life she left behind and the damage she inflicted on those she once claimed to love. This isn't the direction I intended for the story to go, especially when I started with something as seemingly simple as the issue of my wife releasing a bunny into a dangerous area. However, the comments and advice I received made me realize that there were many red flags I overlooked throughout our marriage. I guess I wore rose-tinted glasses for far too long, and I allowed myself to be blinded by my own hopes and illusions. But now, that chapter of my life is definitively closed. I appreciate everyone who took the time to read through my story. It was a long journey, and sharing it has been a necessary part of my healing process. I managed to get my ex-wife's name off the house deed successfully. The bank records proved that only I had ever made payments on the mortgage, which was crucial in proving my sole ownership. During the divorce proceedings, my ex-wife was increasingly combative with the judge, which only worked against her. In an at-fault state like ours, being a confirmed cheater is akin to having a prenup that's turned against you. It's a major disadvantage that can severely impact the outcome of a divorce settlement. When I mentioned that I got the meanest lawyer available, I wasn't exaggerating. My lawyer was relentless, almost like a combination of a bear and a shark, unyielding and aggressive. He fought hard to ensure that the terms of the divorce reflected the severity of my ex's actions. The final settlement was harsh but fair under the circumstances. My ex received $60,000 and the car I had bought for her, which had cost $50,000 when new. The car was fully paid off, and I transferred the title to her as part of the settlement. Despite her initial demands, the settlement was a reflection of what she deserved, given her betrayal and the evidence against her. She was also offered partial custody of our children, but given the clear evidence from the videos showing her disinterest, she chose to forego any custody rights altogether. She realized that fighting for custody would only further expose her lack of commitment and interest in our children. For those who doubt that the police would act on false claims, let me assure you that the law enforcement here takes such matters very seriously. My ex-wife attempted to frame me as an abuser with a smug, sociopathic grin, which was grounds enough for her arrest. The police did not hesitate to act on her attempts to manipulate and deceive. It's a reminder that trying to falsely accuse someone of a crime can have severe legal consequences, and the law is designed to handle such abuses of the system. As difficult as this experience has been, I feel a sense of closure. I'm focused on moving forward with my life and ensuring a stable, loving environment for my children. It's been a challenging road, but I'm committed to doing right by them and building a future that is free from deceit and heartbreak.